Hello again. I can't help but wonder sometimes if those who buy into the traditional view of the transatlantic slave trade ever stop for a moment and ask themselves how they think it actually worked. That is to say, whether many people have considered the logistics of a myth which consists of wicked Europeans sailing to Africa, capturing millions of people there and then transporting them against their will to North America and the Caribbean. Although the transatlantic slave trade is so widely discussed and taught in schools, particularly Black History Month, which is coming up soon, there appears to be some sort of mental block which prevents those who write about or talk of this particular trade from addressing the way in which it actually operated and how it was sustained. One sometimes gains the impression that the average person has a strange notion that the whole business ran smoothly with white Europeans controlling every aspect and black Africans featuring in the narrative just as helpless victims. A moment's thought will soon show the absurdity of this idea. Perhaps readers would like to pause at this point and ask themselves a simple question. A ship of perhaps 50 men anchors off the coast of West Africa. How did that small company go about loading up their ship with hundreds of slaves to take across the Atlantic Ocean? Despite a general and widespread awareness of the transatlantic slave trade, an awful lot of people give little or no thought to the mechanics of the business. Did the crew go ashore and start rounding up people at gunpoint? This would have been a hazardous enterprise and one which would probably need more than a few dozen men. The ships would typically carry anything from between 250 to 600 slaves across the Atlantic. Outnumbered 10 to 1, this would be a dangerous and uncertain undertaking indeed, if they all had to be captured against their will. Were there perhaps British soldiers present to help with the roundup? In fact, most of the traffic took place in independent African kingdoms. What would those African warriors be doing while the white men were capturing their people? Just standing idly by? Of course, the slaves were not captured at all, but bought from African merchants and rulers. One of the biggest exporters of slaves was the Kingdom of Dahomey, about which a new Hollywood film has just been released. The Woman King shows a band of noble female warriors in Dahomey in the 1820s. It is a Disney-style distortion, or more properly a reversal of history. There were female warriors at that time in Dahomey, but they actually engaged in slave raids, capturing neighbouring tribes and selling them to the European slave traders. In the film, of course, those women are shown as being bitterly opposed to the slave trade because it is so immoral. In fact, the prosperity of Dahomey was founded on the slave trade and had been long before the arrival of white people. The trading and exploitation of slaves had flourished there for centuries. I cannot help but recommend this book, Slavery in Africa, published by the University of Wisconsin in 1977, which gives great detail about the slave trade in Africa. Archaeological excavations have revealed, for instance, the sacrifice of slaves that was customary throughout most of the ancient world on the death of a king, and Africa was no exception. We see this in so many cultures that it can hardly be expected that Africa would have proved an exception. Archaeologist Graham Connor unearthed a total of 41 female skeletons, all buried in one pit in what was then Dahomey. These dated from the 13th century and are assumed to be victims of human sacrifice, probably slaves. This was 200 years before any European set foot in the place. Throughout the 19th century, after the British outlawed slavery, Dahomey continued the practice, and it proved impossible for anybody, even the British Empire, to put a stop to it. All this is very embarrassing when African Americans are seeking reparations for the slave trade, And so a film like The Woman King will come in handy to promote the false idea that it was really all the fault of white people.